Welcome back to the Story of Liberty. This is your host, John Bowman. The story of the young boy named Squanto begins in 1605 when he and 4 other Indian friends were taken captive by a ship that was exploring the northeast coast of America. They were taken to England, where Squanto learned English. He lived there for 9 years, and he met Captain John Smith. And Captain John promised to take him and his friends back to Cape Cod as soon as he could get a ship. Well, after 9 years in England, in 1614, Squanto returned to the New England coast with Captain John, and Captain John called that place New Plymouth. During this time, many Indians were shipped to North Africa for the slave trade, but Squanto and a few friends were rescued. One could see the hand of God as Squanto was being prepared for the crucial role he would play in saving the Pilgrims in Plymouth. Squanto ended up making another trip back to London for about 5 years, and he returned with another captain in 1619 to step ashore just 6 months before the Pilgrims would arrive on the Mayflower. But what he found was that every man, woman, and child of his tribe was dead. Nothing but bones remained because of the terrible plague that had killed them all. Squanto was a young man when this happened, and he wandered through the lands where he played as a child, in the woods where he hunted, and in the open areas where he ran. He was a very lonely person, and he had little direction in life at this time. Everyone he knew had been killed by the plague. He wandered into the camp of another Indian tribe, and he talked with the Chief Massasoit. Massasoit was the paramount chief who took pity on Squanto. He liked Squanto, and he told him of peaceful English families who were struggling to stay alive. They had no food to live, and they didn't know the ways of the wilderness. Squanto met at length with Massasoit, and he went with him to Plymouth to interpret for him when they met the Pilgrims. They actually met with Governor John Carver of the Plymouth colony, and a peace treaty of mutual aid was made that lasted over 50 years between the Indians and the white man. The treaty stated that they would not hurt one another. If someone did hurt anyone, they would send the offender to be punished. They would restore anything stolen from each other. They would help each other if any did war against them. And they would help each other to find peaceful solutions. When they met together, they made an agreement to have the men leave their bows and arrows behind. Squanto now had an exciting new life to live. He was no longer lonely. When the great leader Massasoit, who was also a remarkable example of God's providential care for the Pilgrims, when Massasoit left with his entourage after the successful meeting with the Pilgrims, Squanto stayed behind with the Pilgrims. He began to teach them and help them in hundreds of ways, in the ways of the wilderness they knew nothing about. He taught the young men to catch eels out of the mud and how to plant corn the Indian way. So now the corn was planted pointed to the center of each mound, where 3 fishes were placed as fertilizer for the corn. He told them when to plant the corn: in April in the northeast, when the leaves of the oak tree were the size of the ears of the squirrel. He showed them how to guard against the wolves for a couple weeks until the fish decomposed. And now 20 acres of corn began to grow nicely. He showed them how to stalk deer and make maple syrup, which herbs to eat and which were good for medicine. Squanto was also a link in the chain that helped the Pilgrims establish the free market system. I really think he did, because he showed them how to trade for example, the pelt of the beaver that was in huge demand in Europe and plentiful in New England. Squanto made sure they got paid fairly for those fur trade top quality pelts. You know, this, my friends, was the beginning of the economic liberty that the Pilgrims never had before. Now they could trade these beaver pelts in the fur trade business. Well, the 51 survivors took heart as the snowdrifts melted and the buds began to pop out into bloom. 4 entire families were wiped out. Only 3 married couples were left. Only 5 out of 18 wives survived that first winter. The youth were the principal survivors, and 47 in all died, nearly half of their original number that came over on the Mayflower. These starving times in the winter of 1621 and 1622 were reduced to a daily ration of 5 kernels of corn apiece. Did you hear that? 5 kernels of corn. It's hard to understand how difficult life was. But in the midst of this difficulty, the light of Christ gained victory. One example of a proud young man who would often curse the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. The Pilgrims got sick in the Mayflower in the rough weather, most of them. But this young man, he was a seasoned seaman, and he would mock them. He had no compassion on them. But eventually that young man, he grew weak, and they showed him compassion. They helped him. And then he confessed that he didn't deserve this kind of good treatment. He had abused them in words and deed while on the ship. And here's what he said: "You, I now see, you show your love like Christians, indeed to one another, but we let one another lie and die like dogs." Well, after the winter, a couple months later in April, they gathered together to bid farewell to Captain Jones in the Mayflower as if it was going back to England, and the small crew left that survived. The Mayflower had been their only home and shelter since they sailed from England, and now she was going back. But there's something amazing that happened here. I'm sure they didn't want to repeat the terrible voyage, but they knew they had come to Plymouth for a reason, and not one of them chose to return. Half of them had died in the last few months, and yet not one of them went back. See, in the midst of all the dying, they shared the love of Christ in a way that only happens when people are willing to suffer together in His causes. John Carver, the good governor, he soon died while working, and then William Bradford was chosen to take John Carver's place. William Bradford was only 31 years old when he took command in the spring. Now the 20 acres of corn laid out by Squanto brought a rewarding crop. William Bradford called Squanto a special instrument, sent of God for their good, beyond their expectation. The Pilgrims knew Squanto was God sent. They loved him. The small village they had built now had 7 little cabins, and they took their grain, their pumpkins, their dried peas and beans into the common house. They set apart a time for Thanksgiving to their God, and their Indian friends were invited. And Massasoit brought deer and other things, while the Pilgrims brought geese and ducks and turkey. And there you have it, the first Thanksgiving. It lasted 3 days, and it involved sports and running and wrestling. They had fun together. They cemented a friendship between the Indians and the white man. What could be remembered was the prayer in the very beginning of the festivities, when Reverend William Brewster offered a prayer of thanksgiving to the Father of Lights as they began the festival. A couple years went by, and 1623, the Anne and the Little James sailed into Plymouth with 90 new settlers. These newcomers, they were surprised to see the rough condition of the first settlers. Life was tough. And then the drought came again, and the crops were dying in the fields. William Bradford, he called for a day of prayer. And for 8 hours, the people called upon God to save them. Amazingly, a gentle rain began to fall. The corn, the beans, the pumpkins, they lifted their wilted leaves, stood up, and flourished. This dramatic relief stirred their hearts, and now a second Thanksgiving was held in 1623. The plantation economy at this point forward was built on the labor of its own people. They built it. Yes, they did. All were required to work. And the basic philosophy of a calling, a special calling, stressed the duty of each individual to work with his own hands. In fact, their pastor in England, John Robinson, had said earlier, "He that without his own labor, either of body or mind, eats the labor of other men's hands only, and lives by their sweat, is but like lice, and such other vermin." Did you hear that? These strong words were on individual initiative and responsibility, impressed William Bradford and the others to commence the free market system that we have in America today. But this communal system set up by the London Company, the adventurers that owned everything, they basically forced this upon the Pilgrims. It proved a failure. And the young men did not want to work for the wives and the children of older men. The good worker received no more than the poor worker. And the wife disliked washing clothes for others outside of her home. See, this socialism that they tried failed. The idea of all to have all alike and do alike led to discontent and confusion. And the Pilgrims were taken advantage of by this unscrupulous adventurer, this London Company. And at times they had to borrow money at interest rates of up to 50% to pay him back. But they paid back every penny. They showed their Christian character even when they knew they were being taken advantage of. Well, the great event happened in 1623 when William Bradford, he and his assistants decided to assign to every family a parcel of land to cultivate on their own. This new system of free enterprise was an immediate success. Families worked together and the private enterprise era was initiated. This is a far cry from what we have in America today, where a good percentage of the people are receiving some kind of handout from the government. As our current president said, well, let's spread the wealth around. You didn't build it, someone else did. That would infuriate the Pilgrims. Because the Pilgrims initiated the free market system. And people stood on their own legs, and suddenly a new life infused the Pilgrims. Well, it is a far cry from what we have in America today, where people have been taught to just fill out a form and get a check from the government, some kind of handout from the government. It's just not right. Not if you're an able-bodied person that could work. You know, as our current president said, to spread the wealth around, or you didn't build it. This all is diametrically opposite of what the Pilgrims believed. They worked with their own hands, they built it, and they were entitled to the rewards and benefits of their hard work. The Pilgrims initiated the free market system. People stood on their own legs, and suddenly a new life was infused in the Pilgrim colony. They were a mere small handful of people, but they were light bearers for the kingdom of Christ. Along the New England coast and to the yet undiscovered vast America, their message was spread. They brought the light of Christ the Lord to the shores of America. That eventually, over time, in the long haul, further penetrated into the very heart of America. Folks, America was founded as a Christian nation. There is absolutely no doubt about that.